people understand that there's an answer, there's a way. We the people have to say. So send the orders to prepare, that we the people do declare. Send the good news, send the word, we the people will be heard. We
Poverty.
the people everywhere.
It needs to end. Racism also needs to end. I'm Lou Ismay. I'm your host. Some of the items in the news: Gaza, war. Let's start. There's an untold story. The untold story has to do with Gaza and the fact that there was a massacre. Now, we just point out where Gaza is. This was Palestine in 46 and 47 and 67 and now, and here's Gaza. There was a massacre on July 20th in which 90 civilians were killed in one evening, and that massacre had to do also with the death of 13 Israeli soldiers. The massacre was caused because of the death of the soldiers. They had been killed in the fight with Hamas. Whatever the situation was, they were angry. There were two brigades involved. The first brigade was the Golani unit, and the other was the Nekel brigade. Members of those two brigades occupied buildings that had been abandoned or vacated by the Gazans. Their officers made comments, understanding that they were frustrated and angry at the loss of their comrades. The story comes from a man named Salem Iran Efrat. He was a former soldier, spent some time. He was also part of the cast Lead, L-E-A-D, Lead. That was the code name for the previous incursion by the Israeli army into the Gaza Strip approximately 2 years ago. A little bit more, perhaps. Not so important on the date. What is important, that what he saw and experienced at that time caused him, he left the army, whatever that circumstances was, and he began to interview his former comrades. He interviewed soldiers to get an idea of what they thought about what was going on. And so he reported that the officers told their troops that there would be a time when they would be able to sort of settle the score at the loss of their compatriots. And that's what they did. And he described how the officers gave authorization to fire on civilians, when not to fire. And it was an interesting story, and it's also a frightening story. Because it sort of certifies, in a way, that part of the incursion into Gaza was one of retribution, not just with these two military units, but it had that element of extra violence, extra destruction. Now, it's still a ceasefire. We'll see how that goes. One of the things that Everett mentioned was that the Israeli military actually controls the country, keeps things quiet, has far greater influence than is indicated in our media when there are reports about the situation in Palestine. Perhaps we ought to sit down. Perhaps we ought to think through how we're functioning in that part of the world, or anywhere in the world. Who our friends are the people with whom we are friendly, to whom we give support. Do they have the same values that we have? Do we know what our values are? Do we really have values? Or is the idea of American values a myth that does not really exist? A matter of sitting down and discussing things. We're under some tensions. We'll be reporting things that are going on in other parts of the world on this program. And some of these happenings might give us cause for concern and for reflection. Medea Benjamin, a long-time and stalwart activist, interested in what's going on in the world, very interested in women's issues, health issues, and military issues, among other things. And she's a member of Code Pink, very effective organization. Women determined to bring about some changes in the world. She used the term insanity, the insanity of what we are about to do in the Middle East with our president's pronouncements that we're going to get involved not just with bombing, but the possibility, the real possibility, that we'll have some of our own people on the ground. We know the term boots on the ground. Well, she points out that there are 10 countries that are going to be involved with the United States of America in stopping the ISIS, or whatever the name is, of they're more than dissidents. We know that they're wreaking havoc in that part of the world. Well, she mentioned Egypt and Iraq and Jordan and Lebanon and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Kuwait and Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. All those countries around the Gulf state. Now, we're trying something new today, and we're going to have a globe. And those countries are all here. It was a little bit awkward until we get this thing working. There's Jordan, going to be Syria, Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and we're looking at the countries around the Gulf here. Now, there are other countries that are going to be working with us. They're going to be European countries. They include France and Germany, Australia, Denmark, a number of the European countries, as a core coalition, as it's put. So that's NATO, the situation, with so many countries involved. There are countries also that have been a spillover from our incursion into Iraq. These are countries that also are in that part of the world. They include Yemen, Somalia, other countries. So we have a number of countries. Total, approximately, somewhere close to 36 countries. Almost a world war. Almost. There's so many similarities in the number of countries involved and what will be the outcome. Now the president is speaking with the Central Command, discussing strategy. How will this work out? Violence is the key to all of it. Violence, warfare, militarization has been something that has been important to the United States of America. From our very concept. Violence, has it worked? Is it time to try to work at another way of dealing with others in the world? It sounds as if it's a pipe dream, but it could work. Years ago, according to some recent archaeology that's been going on in the Yucatan Peninsula and so regarding the Maya, and how for well over 1,000 years they solved their conflicts, their disagreements, without resorting to total war. Is it possible that there is something that we could work out, that we could propose to the world? Martin Luther King stated that there are 3 things that we need to pay attention to: racism, poverty, and militarization. We do depend on the military. The amount of money that we spend, the amount of money that's spent on military equipment and supplies that we give away or sell to others in the world. We have learned a great deal from technological developments that were originally related to the military, has been useful in helping us to live and work better, to be perhaps a little bit more health conscious. But we are getting into a situation where this strife, along with the climate challenges, is going to create further chaos unless we are very careful, unless we all have, there may be a time when we're all going to have to work together, talk to people who are around in the 1940s, World War II. They may tell about instances where working together with others nationwide was a very important thing in terms of the victory but also in terms of human connections. Well, something else. We have a number of think tanks, especially in the Washington, D.C. area. There was a report discussed on Democracy Now! Brooke Williams was the person who spoke of it and described it. It turns out that there was a special report in the New York Times about how the think tanks in our country work for governments around the world and actually represent those governments and assisting them in getting whatever they need from the United States. So the think tank people lobby Congress and work on behalf of these other countries. It was interesting to note that the countries who depend on oil, fossil fuel, include Norway. And Norway needed some work done, and apparently it was done on their behalf. Not that it's all bad, but that we need to know that other people influence us for their own needs, but are they controlled in any way? Are they registered anyway? The think tanks included the Brookings Institute, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Atlantic Council. And it turns out that there's something in the order of $92 million in that report. So that gives us an idea of the magnitude of the situation. So it's really, in summary, foreign powers are buying influence through these think tanks. What shall we do? Should we do anything? Is it just another piece of news that we sort of shrug off without thinking about it? There's so many things to deal with, impossible to think about all of them. The core question: what kind of a country, what kind of a people are we? Can we agree on something that would help us to think through the best ways to solve our problems, our issues, whatever they are: health, infrastructure, climate change, pollution, health, whatever it is. Is there some principle upon we can agree that would help us to check our issues against that core of ideas, whatever it is? It's not impossible to sit down and discuss things, is it? Another thing revealed on Democracy Now! Recently: big tobacco. This was a report by Stephen Greenhouse, who writes for the New York Times on labor and workplace issues. It turns out that children 12 years old and older, up into their middle teens, at under 18 years of age, working in the tobacco fields, there's a law that permits tobacco growers to employ people, youngsters of those ages. They work 12 hours a day. In one case, a young girl gets up at 5, gets to the fields at 6, works all day long. By the time she's finished working, it's 8 or 8:30 at night. 60-hour work weeks. Health problems, many. There's something known as the green tobacco sickness. It comes about because there's either dew or rain on the tobacco leaves. People who touch those leaves get nicotine poisoning. Adults do, the children do. Nicotine poisoning, vomiting, dizziness, irregular heartbeat, cancer, problems with their nervous system, problems with their reproductive system as they get older. Is this something about which we should be interested? Is this something about which we should express our concerns? Now, these are immigrants. These children are immigrants, or they are children of immigrants, which implies that they were born in this country. The children interviewed talk about how their legs hurt, how their shoulders hurts, their necks, indicating that they're thirsty. They're forced to work even when they are thirsty. One boy goes to the bathroom at his home, whatever it is, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and he waits all day until he returns home that evening in order to take care of his needs. Something to think about, isn't it? These youngsters also drive tractors, heavy equipment. They do heavy lifting. And tobacco leaves have to be dried in tobacco barns. The nearest ones to us here, the Capital District, used to be down in the Connecticut River Valley. Tobacco may still be grown there. They're interesting barns built so that air can be ventilated pretty easily. Now, the height of those barns, 10, 15, 20, 30 meters high. Not all of us are conversant with the term meters. We may hear it, but it's more than 1 yard. 39 inches approximately. Children talk about being careful, otherwise they fall that distance to the ground. Something new to think about. Tavis Smiley was interviewed on Democracy Now! He was asked the question, what would Dr. King do if he were alive these days? He wrote a new book, The Death of a King, the final years of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life. He gave a talk on April 4th in 1967 at the Riverside Church in Manhattan. And he spoke out against Vietnam, which he'd been doing, but this time he was really bringing home or driving through home some of the points. It was at that time that he pulled together the three ideas of racism being most critical, and it is still critical, poverty, and that is still critical, and militarization, and we know that we have that for a long time now. He was interested in the poor people and the campaign, and he was especially interested in youth. Thought a lot about them, spoke to them whenever he had the opportunity. Now, Tavis Smiley pointed out that at that time in our history, 1967, it was okay to talk about poverty and civil rights. But as soon as Dr. King got off on other subjects, poverty and militarization, the White House abandoned him. The media did the same. Even the black media abandoned him. He was practically ostracized. Harris poll indicated at that time that 75% of the people thought that he was irrelevant. And 60% of the black folks also thought him persona non grata. King was especially interested in people of courage. Muhammad Ali was having his problems. He stood up and refused to be drafted for that war. Eartha Kitt, her career ruined as a result of her speaking out at the White House against the war. Turmoil, confusion, chaos to some people, but those years were the beginning. There was success in the civil rights situation, success in the voting rights. The environmental program was getting, concerns were getting into higher gear. There was great opposition to the war by military people, by college people, all through all spectrums of our society were somehow involved. Not everybody was against the war, but a great many were. Tavis mentioned the situation just as an example of King's concerns. He was to give a speech in Cleveland, and he was being driven. The car passed a group of women who were prostitutes, apparently, who shouted some slurs. King insisted that the car be turned around. He got out and spoke with the young women, invited them to his hotel. They showed up later that day at the appointed time, much to the concern of the hotel administration. But they sat for hours talking about things. He wanted them to understand the issues for which he was fighting. And it turned out, to the day, 1 year later, to the day he was assassinated in Memphis, in Memphis in order to help working people. Something to think about. The racism that still exists, even though it's sometimes covered up, but it's still there. And the poverty. And the amount of money that we spend on militarization isn't enough for us to provide adequately for schools, for health, for public services. Can we do better? What do you think? I want to point out something while we're at it. The situation with ISIS, situation in the Middle East, a little bit of history. A man named Remy Kahori, who was the director of the ISSAM, Islam Affairs Institute for Public Policy, International Affairs at the American University of Beirut. And the history that he gave on an interview on Democracy Now! It had to do with war. And American militarism with Arab autocracy or dictatorships. In the late 70s, in Afghanistan, we encouraged people to fight against the Russian occupation. We provided arms, money, training. Then bin Laden came along in the 80s, in the 90s. And he called the United States the far enemy. That we were supporting dictatorships. Then we got into Iraq to liberate Kuwait. It had been attacked by Saddam's forces. And we stayed there and we annoyed people, caused them great concern, because we stayed in Saudi Arabia. Then we became the main enemy. And step by step, in a quick review of history, we are now in the verge of going back. We're already bombing. The people who are against us apparently have a common background. They were jailed in various countries, the countries of Egypt and Jordan, Iraq and Syria, and Tunisia. What shall we do? We're going to change the subject. We're going to see what's going on in China. Something pretty important. This is the current issue of, I'll get too many magazines here. Here we go. Of Rolling Stone. This is the issue of Rolling Stone. This is the story. China. The climate and the fate of the planet. World's biggest polluter. If the amount of coal it burns is not significantly reduced within the next decade, nothing anyone does to stabilize the climate will matter. China wants to frack. It's going to continue burning coal. Now, the situation is such that there may not be time. Chinese emissions peak around 2025. We may just barely have a shot at stabilizing the climate before all hell breaks. Like other climate negotiations held under the banner of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Paris meeting that's coming up is likely to be warped by 25-year-old grudges and profound sense of distrust. But right now, this upcoming meeting in Paris is the only game we have. One member of the State Department climate team told me, if it fails, there's no plan B. The story goes on. Here, what's going on in China? People are unhappy and rioting and protesting. They will have a revolt on their hands if they don't deal with this, as a top U.S. official. Here's our Secretary of State talking with the President Xi of China. This is an example. The smoke like this, just from one small area, a plant, coal-burning plant. The choices that Chinese leaders make now, Al Gore says, will be pivotal to solving the climate crisis. Now, here's a chart. Energy consumption, the U.S. and China. Here we go. China, projected to be up like this. U.S., planning to be almost flat. India, a slow rise. U.S. emissions, CO2 emissions, coming this way. Chinese, up here. China is the largest producer of carbon dioxide emissions. Highly dangerous. China wants to get involved with fracking and maybe wanting to make a deal with the United States in order to learn the technology. But fracking releases methane, which is many times more potent than the greenhouse gases of CO2 that we now have. In one case, there were China, the land is toxic. The rivers are toxic. There are dozens of rivers that are toxic. In one case, there were 16,000 dead pigs floating in one of the rivers. The land is gone. It's polluted. Now, the story is worth reading. How do you strike a deal on climate change when someone thinks that you're out to screw them? Now, the projections summarizing the scientists. We have a crisis coming up by 2030. Some people say, or 2025, some people say, or 2020. But the most serious of all is that 50 years from now, if the issues have not been solved, there is no known way to solve them. That means, if it's true, what will happen to the children who are growing up? What will happen to the people who are now in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s? What kind of a world would it be? Some scientists predict a sixth extinction. All life on Earth. 5 previous times Earth has been devastated and life has come back. What will life be like if there is a sixth extinction in the lifetimes of some of us here now? Should we be more concerned? There's two big marches coming up. This weekend on Sunday, the People's Climate March in New York City. Climate trains, have been traveling from California across the country, picking up people who are going to be in New York City. There are 10 or 12 buses leaving from the Capital District alone to go down. Sometimes all we can do is march and talk and show solidarity. No government that we know of, contemporary times, has made any significant changes until its people speak up. Changes are made by you and I. I make changes, you make changes. Together we make changes, if we want to. The second big march that's coming up is the North Star Peace March, Sunday the 21st, same date that the march in New York City. The march starts at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the mosque in Central Avenue in Albany. People are going to be wearing white or some white garment indicating peace. They're going to stop and visit churches and synagogues along the way. People locally want to work together, want to have to together address the problems that are the issues here in Albany and Schenectady and Troy and Rensselaer, Saratoga Springs, and quite an area around. Participate. Be heard. Locally, we still have the situation with fracking. Miss Teachout, who gave Mr. Cuomo a run during the primary election, will support Cuomo only if he supports no fracking. If he supports fracking, she will not give her endorsement. It's an interesting situation. Then we have the trains coming through with oil, the tank cars. Parking right next to, one can reach through the fence and almost touch the tank cars. They're that close to the people's homes. So that's another issue. We started to talk last week about this story and the current issue of the Smithsonian, and this is the Smithsonian. Big story about the monuments at Stonehenge. But this is a story about which we were talking. We said we'd come back to it. 9,000-year-old man, and this is the lead up to the story. Now, the interesting thing is that this is a reconstruction of the space, a very highly skilled process. He is not related to Native North Americans or South Americans. He was related to a a group that no longer exists. And the interesting part is the way that he was, what was discovered by scientists who study his skeleton. These are his teeth, worn down, no cavities, so there was no sugar and no starch in his diet. His shoulders, his arms were strong. This is the laboratory where he was studied by Dr. Douglas Owsley. He's more related to the people in Japan, the Ainu. He's not related to the Polynesians. So they took those two, they used, because of the closeness to their DNA, they constructed his eyes with that in mind. Given his height and weight, he suffered injuries, broken ribs that did not heal. Now, he was an outdoors person. He was muscular. He used his right arm for some sort of work that required stabbing or doing something. His muscular structure, the tendons, muscles, leave little marks on the bones where they're attached, where the muscles are attached to the bone. And that indicated that he had an arm with the muscular structure that we would expect to see in a professional baseball pitcher. He had, this is his skull. This is a bone, in his hip bone, a chert arrow point. This is a model of that arrow point. It could not be removed, so they took a photograph and measurement and reconstructed that. He was buried by people who cared for him. With injuries that he suffered, according to the record left in his bones, he could not have survived alone, so that meant that people knew him and took care of him. He was buried deliberately. It wasn't an accidental thing. He was buried along a stream, and that was his position in which the body was, the skeleton was found. So, he was found in a place called Kenilworth. Let's get this map here. A little bit awkward this morning while we're photographing this. Here. Kennewick, little island, peninsula rather, in the state of Washington. So it's the Kennewick area, Columbia River. It's interesting that a story can be told by examining a skeleton, looking at whatever artifacts can be found. Remember the man who was found a few years back in the Alps, Bronze Age chap, clothing. Interestingly, That man was found with moss in his shoes to give him protection from the cold. And U.S. Military discovered, and it was published in an issue of the Infantry Journal back during World War II, that the German troops were using the same kind of technology, and they included newspapers to keep a man's feet from freezing. And the soft moccasin type of shoe is flexible, so that a man works in, anybody walking in bitter cold won't get frozen feet if they had some insulation. And because of the soles are not rigid, the foot flexes, toes flex, and that increases the circulation. So that's a good survival tactic if we ever get glaciers in this world again. Now, here are a couple of cartoons, and then we take a look at another magazine. Times Union. Nude celebrity photos leaked. And this chap is, that's horrible. And when can we see them? Obamacare. I told you Obamacare would be a disaster. Actually, it's a big success. You're only supposed to pay attention to what I tell you. And here's the third one. The U.S. may have to choose between warring parties in Syria. Choose. There's Assad and there's ISIS. That would be an interesting one, wouldn't it? September 11th. The Twin Towers. New York City. September 11th, 1814. Plattsburgh. Two events in New York. 9/11 and 9/11/1814. Naval battle. This is from the Albany Times Union. Photograph of the burned White House that was burned by the British. There was a land battle and a sea battle, sea battle, well, not sea, but a lake battle at Plattsburgh. The British were defeated. A major force of British were defeated. And the result was that a few days later, Old Glory was still flying in Baltimore at Fort McHenry, and the British retreated, and the world went back to a peaceful course. Now, this is one of the things that's kind of interesting. The rich and the mega rich. This is the bottom 90%, that little line at the bottom. The top 10% are the next, orange. The top 1% is here. The top 0.01% are here. And these are the dates, the years. We're up here to 2005, 6, but we see the difference. This big gap between the very, very, very wealthy and the everyday folk is always dangerous. It indicates who really runs the world. It breaks havoc to the people at the bottom. The idea that causes chaos and turmoil is well established in history. What shall be done? Violence can erupt just on the basis of that big gap. What shall we do? Is there anything we can do? It may mean that there'll be some changes in our financial system and how we operate. Eventually something will happen. Can't always predict, but at least we should be aware. We look forward to being together the next time. Thank Glenn Jarrett for his engineering. Remember the food banks and the food pantries, the independent hardware stores and the independent bake shops and candy shops, and especially independent book houses and the independent cinemas. I've been your host, Lou Ismay. In the meantime, till we meet again, pay attention. If you don't like what's going on, organize.
And we won't accept the lies of those who lead our nations into hell. It's time to call their bluff and say to them, enough's enough. It's time we all should hear the tolling of the bell. And it's time to feed the hungry, and it's time to heal the pain, and it's time to beat our weapons into plows. It's time